You're listening to Simply Put, a podcast from FHN Financial. I'm your host, Will Compernal. Municipal bonds have benefited from favorable tax treatment in the United States for over 100 years. Some policymakers have discussed repealing the Muni tax exemption this year to help balance the federal budget and fund other fiscal priorities. At the same time, state and local governments are starting to plan for a potential future involving significant cuts in transfer payments from the federal government. On today's episode, we talk with Emily Brock, Director of the Federal Liaison Center at the Government Finance Officers Association, about the Muni tax exemption's role in local infrastructure investment, the fiscal interdependence between the federal and state governments, and how the Muni market is responding to possible policy changes this year. Stay tuned. Coming up soon, our interview with Emily Brock, but first, a quick market update. The March employment report this morning showed 228,000 jobs added last month, and the unemployment rate up slightly at 4.2%. With revisions to January and February data, 3-month average payrolls growth fell from 188,000 to 157,000. Fed officials have thus far expressed confidence in a resilient labor market, preferring to keep policy somewhat restrictive while price pressures hover above its long-term 2% target. President Trump's long-advertised Tariff Liberation Day finally occurred earlier this week. The president announced 10% tariffs on all imports to the U.S., additional tariffs based on each country's bilateral trade balance with the U.S., and some narrow exemptions like USMCA-compliant goods from Canada and Mexico. The financial market reaction was decisively risk-off. Last night, China announced 34% tariffs on U.S. imports and export controls on rare earths. Global equity markets fell and bond markets rallied. 10-year Treasury yields fell below 3.90% today after reaching 4.40% as recently as last Thursday. The February core PCE deflator accelerated to a 0.4% monthly gain last week, exceeding the consensus estimate by 0.1%. The bond market dismissed the hot inflation reading and instead focused on the meager 0.1% increase in inflation-adjusted consumer spending. Together with January data, first quarter personal spending is poised for a market slowdown from Q4. The Atlanta Fed's GDP Now model is estimating negative 0.8% Q1 GDP growth after adjusting for how gold factors into international trade. March vehicle sales rose to a 17.8 million annualized rate, the highest since 2021 and a notably strong piece of economic data amidst otherwise weaker reports. The rise partially reflected some consumers front-running expected tariffs, so it's unclear whether that strength will continue into the second quarter. Nonetheless, it does give a boost to first quarter consumer spending measures. That's all for the market update this time. Now, our interview with Emily Brock. Our guest today is Emily Brock, Director of the Federal Liaison Center at the Government Finance Officers Association. Emily, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Will.
Our discussion today will focus on the relationship between federal fiscal policy and the municipal bond market. Now, just to dive right into the tax reform question, as Republicans continue refining their plans this year for taxes and spending, I think one thing that has kept coming up is the idea of eliminating the municipal tax exemption. So in January, the Senate Budget Committee estimated that this would save the federal government $250 billion over 10 years, which of course frees up some space for maybe some more tax cuts or leaving in some spending, increasing spending. Emily, can you tell us more about what the municipal tax exemption is and how it helps shape the muni market?
Sure, that's an easy one. It's kind of built into my my DNA these days. Well, I've been with the Government Finance Officers Association for 10 years now, which means that I have seen one of the most recent and largest tax reforms that took a scalpel to the municipal bond market, and that is the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But before I get to that, just a little bit about municipal bonds. Municipal bonds are a tax-advantaged instrument for state and local government, that is tax-exempt entities, to issue municipal securities to investors who are interested in investing in infrastructure across the country. Now, municipal bond market, for what it's worth, has tallied to a grand total of about $4 trillion right now. So you heard that right. The municipal bond market underpins about $4 trillion worth of infrastructure in our country. And so anytime the federal government, whether it's Congress or the way the administration shapes the carrying out of tax policy, that impacts $4 trillion worth of investments across our country. So it's important that we stay vigilant, that we notice whether it's a sledgehammer approach or a scalpel approach, that we don't diminish that essential tool for infrastructure because it is so incredibly important for folks across the United States.
So, what is the argument, sort of the spirit behind maintaining that exemption? Why should we treat municipal debt different in the tax system than other debt? Of course, infrastructure for states and local governments is important, but there are a lot of other important things. Is this something that we have come to believe is essential for those investments, or how should we think about it?
Municipal bonds have been in place for over 100 years. And what that means is state and local governments have utilized that tool effectively for investments in infrastructure. Now, when you're asking me why in the world is it so important, it's built into the fabric, the social fabric of our country. I know when I'm driving around in my city that the bonds that I vote for through referenda build my kids' middle school. They build the parks that we go to. They build all of the essential infrastructure that I vote for, that I have a direct vote in. Now, that's an important element of it. But when it comes down to brass tacks, which is kind of what you're asking, I think, when we look at the differential between municipal entity borrowing at a taxable rate versus a tax exempt rate, the difference there is about 200 basis points. And if you map that 200 basis points differential over top of that $4 trillion market that we have, that comes out to the tune of about $824 billion in savings for state and local governments to provide essential infrastructure. And if you want to get even closer to ground level, $824 billion in savings equates to about $6,500 per household. So it's important to continue to maintain the market simply for the physical infrastructure investments themselves, but turn to the other side of the coin. Who's buying bonds? When you look at sort of the framework of who is buying bonds, what we're talking about is individuals. It's not institutional investors, it's individual investors investing in bonds, investing in their community. And the reality is that we're seeing even more about ages 65 and over. So, Will, if you kind of think about it colloquially, we're talking about grandmas and grandpas that own municipal bonds in their retirement portfolios. It's an incredibly important instrument, not just for the infrastructure, but also for the safe and sound investments, those fixed income investments for retirees in our communities.
It's interesting that you pointed out how ingrained, how baked in it is to our current tax code going back 100 years, because in doing some research for this interview, I saw that when the constitutional amendment was passed to allow for a federal income tax, there was a huge kind of clarification in the tax code that municipal debt would be exempt from this. And I think even before 1913, when that was passed, there were Supreme Court cases saying the federal government can't get in the way of taxing this type of debt. So it really is such a part of the current way that our government approaches infrastructure and taxation between, the federal government and states. So it would clearly represent a pretty significant shock to the muni market if this exemption were to be changed with a sledgehammer, as you say, or a scalpel. As it stands today, what do you think the likelihood is of this exemption being cut? Are industry representatives successfully communicating the impact to policymakers?
I'm seeing a lot of effort on the Hill. And it's important to note that while I represent a very substantial issuer community, that is the government finance officers, we represent about 25,000 issuers of municipal securities, that is the governments and the nonprofits that issue municipal securities, there's also a whole host of other market participants that are at risk and are showing up on the Hill. Like, for example, our partners who are municipal advisors, our partners who are bond counsel, our partners who are the lending institutions, the banks themselves. And so in some cases, we're starting to see investors in municipal securities show up on the Hill. So I think we need to pay credit where credit's due. We are not sitting around waiting to play defense. We are very clearly on offense, and we're out there. We're telling the stories of what has been built by bonds and communities, which is important. I'm sure we'll get to this question soon, because there is not a fully baked cake just yet. We're still waiting to see that fully baked cake. We just want to make sure that we are not one of the ingredients inside of that baked cake.
Great analogy. What is the timeline exactly? Would any changes to the Muni tax exemption happen in the Senate's budget reconciliation bill? Sorry, Congress's budget reconciliation bill this year, or would it be separate? Do you think this is going to be a change that really comes soon, or it's still wait and see?
All tax conversations have to be a part of budget reconciliation. The budget reconciliation is really a fancy word for a way for the Senate to fast track tax laws unless they have a 60-40 vote margin. So anytime you have a Republican-Democrat margin that's any less than 60-40, and they're talking about a tax impact that's going to have a revenue impact on the public fisc, the federal fisc, what that means is they have to go through this reconciliation process. That budget amendment that determines sort of the guardrails for budget reconciliation is currently being discussed. And what's important to note is this is where that headline, the one big beautiful bill, comes into play. The House and Speaker Mike Johnson and President Trump, for what it's worth, would love to see one big beautiful bill simply because they are ready to act. Arguably, the margins in the House are even tighter than those in the Senate. You've got a 217, 215 majority. So the Republicans who are in the House are going to have to show up. They're going to have to produce something in order to get reelected. So that one big, beautiful bill, the concept is, well, let's create a budget reconciliation document that includes all of our campaign promises. That is tax plus climate plus immigration. And that is a lot of things to tackle in the one big beautiful bill. On the other hand, the Senate, again, which is, a little bit more of a steady hand, a sort of voice of reason, is saying, absolutely not. That's too much. Let's deal with climate and immigration first, and then we'll have some time to think and apply tax principles to a second reconciliation bill, because the Senate is arguing we have time. There's no need to get hasty here. That is the current discussion that's happening. Can there be some kind of agreement between the Senate's approach to budget reconciliation and the House's approach to budget reconciliation? And that certainly is the current discussion, if I must say so. That it might even happen after we edit this podcast, but there may yet very soon be an agreement that happens between the Senate and the House. That's when the timeline starts ticking. The House and Senate, if they do come to an agreement on that budget reconciliation bill, then have at the very latest through summertime to pass the very large budget reconciliation. And if tax is a part of that, then per your discussion right at the very top, the tax exemption is $250 billion that could potentially be used to pay for other tax titles that this Republican House would like to address.
Now, a recent episode we had was talking about GSE reform in the mortgage market, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And one thing that really stuck with me is how, we can think of ideal policy changes we want, but you really have to consider what the transition process would be like. So it's not so disruptive to the market that something breaks. So in the case of changes to the municipal tax exemption. And again, this is just speculative because we haven't seen anything written in one big, beautiful bill or many smaller bills of different attractiveness. But do you think that exemption would impact just newly issued securities? Do you think that already issued bonds would kind of be grandfathered in, and then it creates this complicated bifurcation of, a pre-reform industry and a post-reform muni bond market?
That's a great question, but the reality is what we've seen, that number that you pulled out at the top of the hour, that $250 billion comes from an official Joint Commission on Taxation score. That score is if the entire municipal bond market were taxable, then we would raise $250 billion. That's an important distinction. $250 billion includes taxing outstanding municipal securities. Now, to your point, and as I described before, what that means is reaching into my parents' retirement account and taxing securities that they own and depend on for their livelihood. I don't think that's the intention of Congress, or at least I hope it's not.
It's tough because people bought those securities under a certain set of circumstances or promises, and if you change that after they're issued, that's not good. That's not good for trust and credibility in the market.
Not only that, but also contractual obligation, the contract that exists between the issuer and their investor.
So what do you think it looks like if the muni market becomes fully taxable? Do you think states and local governments, I think it's fair to say, now suddenly their borrowing costs go up to reflect the fact that this tax exemption is no longer there? Would states and local governments be able to weather that? Are they going to cut headcounts, cut spending, increase taxes? Or is it just a significant event that it's hard to tell how states would adjust?
I cannot even speculate, Will. And the reason for that is because state and local governments operate with a finite set of revenue-raising policies at their local level, and some of them choose to use all of the resources available, that is property, sales, and income taxes, and some haven't. So the variety of different ways that revenue raising occurs at state and local governments really is grounded on the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution, that is states' rights. So it's a very important notion to say states, while they are resilient, these principles that have been sort of baked into an infrastructure plan and capital plans that are trillions of dollars, a part of the fabric of our country, I can't even speculate what it would look like if we lost the tax exemption.
Now, another part of potential tax reforms that involve state and municipal governments has to do with the SALT deduction. So under current tax law, taxpayers can deduct up to $10,000 of certain state and local taxes from their taxable income. There have been proposals to raise this cap, which of course would lower federal revenues, but is there any chance that this gets thrown in there as a package deal? So you take away the municipal tax exemption, which raises tax revenues, and then the SALT deduction is increased as a way to offset that, and maybe states and local governments are able to fund infrastructure in just the same way because now there is some political appetite for high earners in these high tax states to kind of endure those higher tax rates to spend more on state and local infrastructure.
Go back to sort of the principle of the question, which is the huge math problem that Congress has in front of it is in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act cost $1.5 trillion. And the only way that they could get through budget reconciliation to pay for that $1.5 trillion was to put a cap on this SALT tax. So that state and local tax exemption in and of itself, the SALT cap is what I call it. The SALT cap in and of itself was a major pay for the $1.5 trillion bill that passed in 2017. Fast forward to 2025, what it cost the federal government $1.5 trillion to pass in 2017. That is, if you look at all of the tax titles that are about to sunset, Congress has in front of it a big big math problem, which CBO argues is no longer costing them $1.5 trillion. Instead, the Congressional Budget Office has made a determination that in order to extend all of the tax titles of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it's going to cost the federal government $4.5 trillion. Now, think about that for a second. $4.5 trillion is not only 3 times more than the proceeds that they had to find in 2017, but also couple that with many campaign promises been made along the way. So, for example, SALT is one of them. President Trump happened to mention the SALT cap when he was in New York, talking about that SALT cap and how it should go away. Well, that probably brought a lot of delight to a bipartisan caucus that has worked very long to repeal the SALT cap since 2017. So the fact is, again, going back to those narrow margins, the 217 to 215 in the House, any floor vote, any kind of challenge, I think, to the math problem, that is the $4.5 trillion math problem, is going to fall back on, well, how do we raise those funds? If you actually raise the SALT cap, that's less money that's going toward the $4.5 trillion tab that's needed for the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Let's also add in the child tax credit, which also enjoys bipartisan support. So the math isn't mathing just yet. And so we're struggling right now with understanding the priorities of this Congress. But if we go back to the heart of your question, which is it a trade-off for state and local governments? If SALT cap is relieved, then does that relieve any of the increased borrowing costs that are a result of losing the tax exemption? The answer is no. It's a simple no. The SALT cap in and of itself is such a politically divisive discussion that even if they were to jiggle with it or to bring it up a fraction of what it was, it really could not imitate that $824 billion in savings that comes as a result of the application of the tax exemption.
Now, shifting from federal tax policy to federal spending policy, I think a lot of people can be surprised at just how much of the federal budget consists of transfers to the states. So can you talk a bit about what areas of state budgets get the most support from these federal transfers and how much it varies across states? So are we talking mostly Medicaid spending, support for highway construction? Where is that money going?
Well, I think there's a large variety of fiscal relationships that exist between the federal government and the states. Frankly, there has been a stepping up of those transfers that has happened in a very recent pandemic, that is in 2020 and 2021. So when we would talk about sort of the mandatory spending of the federal government, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits, student loans, other farm subsidies, things like that, what I like to say is, those are your YouTube TV subscription that you entered into 5 years ago, and now you just love the show so much you cannot get rid of that YouTube TV subscription, but you know it's going to go up and up and up and up. And so addressing those issues of mandatory spending is certainly a tactic that we've heard from several congressional budget offices to say, well, maybe that's instead where we find the pay-fors. GFOA doesn't have an opinion on where or how. We certainly are monitoring those discussions and, of course, intend to let our members know whether it is a tax expenditure or mandatory spending or discretionary spending where the federal government is seeking to raise funds for this tax plan. We are certainly up for the fight of preserving and maintaining both funding and financing relationships.
So just from a bird's eye view perspective, I don't necessarily support this argument, but I do understand the kind of intuition behind it. If we really take that sledgehammer or machete or whatever tool you want to describe to the federal budget, specifically for the spending transfers to the states. Now, of course, states might have to increase their own taxes in order to pay for things now. You're just shifting the burden. But to kind of give some support to that argument, since 2013, outstanding Treasury issuance has more than doubled. Issuance of corporate debt has gone up more than 50%, but muni issuance has barely increased. I think it's just been a few percent between 2013 and 2023. So is it possible that the bond market would be able to absorb those new borrowing costs from states and municipalities just because, well, if we slash the federal deficit, it does shift the burden, but that means that investors that would otherwise be investing in treasuries are not going to invest in munis? Or are munis and treasuries just two totally different animals and we can't consider them equivalent?
In terms of fixed income instruments, there are obviously investors that are more interested or it suits their asset profile more favorably. When it comes to municipal securities, I can speak to municipal securities. They are liquid, they are safe, they are far less risky than corporate securities. And so we do have extremely fervent market and investors who do look for municipal securities as they are coming out. I would argue, though, Will, there has been a bit of an uptick in municipal securities issuance as recently. Certainly, states and local governments are ensuring that the investments in infrastructure are happening across the country and are doing so, of course, according to the referenda as they are voted on locally. And so in terms of digesting or being able to somehow go to taxable securities, I think the biggest number and the biggest challenge that needs to be thrown up there is that $824 billion. Is that something that state and local governments, state and local governments can themselves digest? Certainly that will be pushed down to the taxpayer, which I am certain the federal government does not intend to do.
We're only a couple months into the new administration. I think a lot of these early actions have been contested in the courts, or there's been some sort of bottleneck, and we're not sure where the dust is going to settle. So when it comes to these changes of federal transfers to states, how much are states challenging them? Do they feel like it's something that the executive branch can't do unilaterally and it's going to have to turn to Congress and maybe that won't happen? Or are state and local governments just thinking, okay, we got to figure out a way to fund this stuff on our own?
It is a contractual discussion where the letters of award agreed to. That is between the grantee and the grantor. And certainly that's where the litigation comes into. GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association, that is my organization. When we noticed Office of Management and Budget, the OMB memo that did go out on the federal funding freeze, we did ask our members to kind of look inside, look at your internal controls and try to map out exactly those relationships that the state or local government does have with the federal government, track it, understand where the contracts are, what the promises of deliverables to the grantor are, right? Did you sign and say you would produce certain outcomes, or did you sign and say that you would produce certain projects? And if so, just make sure that you're monitoring that. But probably one of the largest things that we mentioned to our members, certainly for a sense of internal controls, is just be careful and cautious and think across the organization before you enter into those third-party contracts that are dependent upon federal funds. So we are talking to our members, making sure that they're firm in their resolve if they are entering into federal funding relationships, and then make sure that in preparation for executing those projects or those programs that all parties are prepared and, like you said, are monitoring the litigation as it goes through.
So we were talking earlier about how the budget math was really difficult to reconcile for Republicans in terms of, let's say, removing the muni tax exemption on the tax side. And then on the spending side, there is a lot of pushback from the cuts that we've seen, the federal transfers to the states. So as far as I can see it, there are a lot of obstacles to choking off support from the federal government to the states, whether it's from the tax side or the spending transfers side. Is it possible that by the end of this year, when the dust settles, this relationship between the federal government and states, when it comes to fiscal policy and taxes and support, is not going to look all that different than it was 3 months ago.
Well, I think that's an excellent observation in that we have, throughout the course of the history of our country, established a great deal of sovereignty to states, and in some cases even the sovereignty to the local governments to be able to make fiscal decisions and to execute those fiscal decisions in their own communities. But at the end of the day, infrastructure network is a national objective to ensure that there are interstate highways and to ensure that there's continuity in water service and there's addressing infrastructure needs in rural communities. And so the variety of ways that state and local governments can and do make their own choices on infrastructure, and the participation of federal government to the extent that there are effective ways for it to contribute in a national infrastructure framework. We are certainly happy to tell that story and continue to tell the story to our champions on the Hill, who firmly believe that without the tax exemption, it is important to continue that fiscal relationship between the federal government and state and local governments. Let me rewind that. I don't know why I said without the tax exemption. That with the tax exemption, together, the federal, state, and local governments can provide that $4 trillion worth of infrastructure that our country relies on.
Emily Brock, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Will.
That was Emily Brock, Director of the Federal Liaison Center at the Government Finance Officers Association. I think that interview really spelled out just how important the Muni tax exemption is to state and local infrastructure investment. I found it particularly helpful to understand the exemption in the context of a possible increase in the SALT deduction. Some have argued an increase in the SALT deduction could offset the higher financing costs local governments would face from a removal of the Muni tax exemption. But the two policies are orders of magnitude apart, and it's almost certain a higher SALT deduction would not be able to replace the preferred tax treatment that munis currently enjoy. Financial markets will continue digesting the implications of the new global tariff regime for the foreseeable future. The Treasury market could struggle to find its footing as new retaliatory tariffs are announced, foreign leaders try to negotiate lower rates, and estimates of the economic impacts emerge. Next week's CPI and PPI for March will give some final inflation data for the first quarter. The consensus estimate for the core CPI is a 0.3% monthly increase, but there were meaningful differences between the CPI and the Fed's preferred PCE deflator the first 2 months of the year. As a result, the market will focus on what the PCE-specific components in the PPI signal for the March PCE deflator when the PCE report is released at the end of this month. Next Wednesday, we'll see the minutes from the Fed's March meeting. Although that meeting's projections and statements were largely unchanged from the Fed's January decision, we expect there was a lot of disagreement and deliberation below the surface. FOMC participants have publicly expressed different opinions about the economic impacts of tariffs and how the Fed should respond. The minutes could shed light on those divergent views. The following week, the March retail spending report will signal whether consumer spending bounced back after some depressed levels in January and February. If the vehicle sales data for March are any guide, consumers may have accelerated their spending on many goods categories to front-run tariffs last month. Also that week, the bond market will be closed on April 18th for Good Friday. SIFMA is recommending an early close the day before as well, so trading volumes will be subdued overall during the week of April 14th. That's all for today's episode. Thanks again for listening. I'm Will Compernell, macro strategist with FHN Financial. This episode was edited by Bill Stanfield. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Simply Put wherever you get your podcasts. Email simplyput@fhnfinancial.com with any questions or comments. This podcast is presented for informational purposes only and is not intended as an offer or solicitation with respect to the purchase or sale of any security. Views expressed herein accurately reflect the speaker's personal views about the data, news, trends, events, etc. discussed herein or any subject securities or issuers. No part of their compensation was, is, or will be, directly or indirectly, related to any specific recommendations or views expressed. FHN Financial, through First Horizon Bank or its affiliates, offers investment products and services. Investment products are not FDIC insured, have no bank guarantee, and may lose value.